Thank you very much. I just see whether I can share my screen with you. Okay.
Yes.
I think
okay.
you can see it. Yes. Okay.
Yes, it's okay.
Welcome to this session. I guess the situation in Europe, of course, you're also part of Europe, but each region of the world is facing rather difficult times, but also for us as economists or social scientists, also very interesting times, yeah? So there's a lot of research going on in many parts of the world on the impact of the epidemic. But of course, by now we are looking further beyond that and how the world is going to recover. And well, I'm not going to include Russia in my analysis of the European economy, so it will be quite EU-centered, plus looking at some of the economies which are quite closely attached to the European Union, like the Western Balkan countries. But let me give you an overview of what I want to cover. Well, I want to start with looking at the state the European economy was when it was exposed to this shock. You know, the previous 10 years was a recovery from the financial crisis, and in that sense, it was in a vulnerable state. So I'll talk a little bit about the macroeconomic context, which existed before that, talk about the way how policy responded to the COVID shock on the basis of what happened before that. And I'm also going to emphasize a bit the long run issues. There are sort of centrifugal forces, there are also cohesion forces, but there are also centrifugal forces within the setup, the policy setup, and probably you can go beyond it, the political economic setup in which Europe is finding itself. And there are developments through the pandemic crisis in both directions. And I'm also going to cover a bit of time on the social legacies, what was happening structurally during the pandemic. And of course, we are all concerned about what sort of legacy the pandemic will have on the social structures, particularly on labor markets, but also beyond that. And finally, I will talk a bit about, are there going to be major policy shifts within the European Union and in the cohesion of countries which form the European Union? So, as I mentioned before, the COVID crisis hit the EU economy when it was in a rather vulnerable state, economically and politically. There was the legacy of the financial crisis. I'll come back to that. As you all know, there is a continuous long discussion about the incompleteness of the policy framework which the EU has set up. There were some responses to the financial crisis where one tried to make major reforms, but it is still to an important extent quite incomplete. And I mentioned to you before that there are centrifugal forces, forces which are making coordination difficult and behaving like a federal state would behave, let's say like the United States would behave, and I guess Russia would behave. There are sort of ingrained creditor-debtor relationships within the European Union, which means that different countries position themselves differently in negotiating about any change or use of the policy framework. And I think I'll also want to emphasize that there are sort of long-run structural issues, which has something to do with agglomeration processes of tradable activities, particularly manufacturing, but also to some extent tradable services, which lie behind longer-term external imbalances within the European Union, which have for a long time been ignored, but of course they became acute. One became acutely aware during the financial crisis that external imbalances within the European Union are very important. And of course there are political dissonances. One speaks now partly about some systemic, political economic systemic divergences which might exist to some extent within the European economic situation. There is of course also the big need to a very rather rapid or accelerated change in geoeconomic and geopolitical context, which is becoming more and more visible as the pandemic was going on, and there's a lot of discussion about that as well. So if we move to the sort of structural shifts which are directly sort of linked to the COVID crisis, they, to some extent, are basically accelerating trends which were happening before that, and they became much more apparent, and they started to make us think much more what are the implications for the post-COVID situation in all our countries, I guess. So on one hand, there are the technological changes which are somehow linked to digitization. There is this experience of a quite large number of employees starting to work or being forced to work from home or wanting to work from home. And there's a lot of differentiation in this respect in the labor force. There was a big fall and slump in traveling, not only tourism, but also business traveling, how international firms are operating in terms of their mobility patterns. There is, especially because of shortages which developed and certain problems one found in the continued supplies with vital inputs and products, especially in the health system. There's a drive towards more self-sufficiency, but that goes beyond it. It's of course also a reaction to the changing geoeconomic, geopolitical climate, and linked with that, there was a shift thinking to some extent about supply chain diversification and reorientation. Okay, there are many things which one could cover, but I'm not going to cover any of these in great depth. But let me come back to the state in which the European economies were when the COVID crisis hit. As I mentioned, there was a legacy, a structural legacy in the European economy, where it was quite striking that patterns of uneven growth, different countries, different regions developed at different speed, recovered at different speeds, were hit to different degrees by the financial economic crisis, and it really became much more strongly visible that convergence is not necessarily the dominant pattern in European economic developments. Linked with that, and I mentioned to you before that we became much more conscious of the importance of current account situations within Europe, and that there are chronic external imbalances amongst countries within the European Union. And of course, if you have that in a chronic way, in a sustained way, it leads up to quite significant debt and creditor positions within the European Union. And that gets reflected in household, company, balance sheets, debt positions. That itself gets reflected in the relative strengths or weaknesses of banks. And of course, in public debt buildup, which was quite differentiated across the European Union. And of course, the public debt buildup matters during the epidemic and also in the post-epidemic recovery, because it constrains to different degrees fiscal space. And if that is the case and one doesn't do anything much about it in a coordinated manner, it would move into a spiral where interest rate differentials would emerge on financial markets. It makes the debt servicing more difficult and for different countries, and therefore constrains fiscal action even more. So I think it was quite clear to policymakers that one had to react to these forces, which were forces which would bring countries on different trajectories. So I think some of these numbers are already a bit outdated, but I think overall one can say from a macroeconomic point of view that the contraction during the pandemic was even stronger than it was during the initial years of the financial crisis. On the other hand, one feels that there might be more of a V-shaped recovery. And of course, to some extent, the policy lessons from the financial crisis might support a more V-shaped recovery, which hopefully will be more sustained. However, we all think, and I think it seems quite obvious by now, that the recovery, just like after the financial crisis, will be more moderate compared to the recovery of the US economy, not to speak of China and other economies. And what we see so far in terms of unemployment developments are still hiding much more problematic developments which might appear immediately after the crisis has the more severe part of the crisis is over. And I think one of the important things is it's important not just look at unemployment rates. It's very important to see how activity rates are developing, which segments of the population have been supported by short-term measures, but these short-term measures might be either taken out or sustained in a much less massive way, and therefore some segments of the population might be chronically inactive in the labor market. So I think a lot of things which will be observed in the labor markets. So this is the picture which you are probably quite familiar with. The euro area mismanaged the recovery from the financial crisis quite strongly. There are probably policy mistakes, but there are also structural reasons for that. You can see there is this famous double dip in 2013, which probably was really mistaken monetary policy to some extent, but also probably the differential macro policy responses in different countries. Some of them not exploiting the fiscal space they had before that. This double dip was then overcome, and then there was a sort of parallel development, but a sustained gap which was never captured later on by the euro area. And of course, what motivates policymakers now is can one avoid that sort of, again, another dip and a gap developing compared to a comparator economy, which is always a comparator economy for the euro area. The other thing which is, of course, very important is the well-known North-South divide within the European Union. We can see that there was a sort of not too much of a catching up going on in GDP per capita between the North and the South. The South here is population-weighted group of countries: Greece, Spain, Italy, and Portugal. And you can see that in brackets. The North is a subset of countries: Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, Austria, Finland, yeah, just for comparison. You can see during the financial crisis that gap widened quite significantly. And we can see even in the newest data, these are sort of again, we see a further opening up of the gap more recently during the pandemic. And of course, partly what lies behind it is, well, some structural problems which are sustained, but of course also the relative positions in terms of fiscal space. Here you can see the public debt positions of the different European euro economies. On the left-hand side, you can see Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, so all the southern economies, but also France and Belgium, which had built up a much worse public debt position prior to the current crisis. So I think this is an obvious thing which people had in mind when they pushed towards much more fiscal coordination and to some extent sharing the burdens and also the risks of undertaking fiscal and monetary policy during the pandemic, and hopefully in a more sustained way also after that. I mentioned to you the sort of external imbalances. Here you can see I just picked up two groups of countries which are very different from each other. You can see on the left-hand side, Greece, that's ELAS, EL, Spain, ES, Italy, and Portugal, which prior to the financial crisis had very significant current account deficits. And you can see in quite a few countries, except for Italy, this was mostly due to the trade balances, which are the blue bars, which were chronically negative, quite substantially negative. It's true also in many other countries. On the right-hand side, you see a very different picture. You can see basically the Central European new member states of the EU, which really did very well also prior to the financial crisis and continue to do well in building up very positive trade balances, these dark blue lines, while the orange lines are basically income transfers, basically mostly profit repatriation by multinational companies. But overall, you can see the current account situation having improved even prior to the financial crisis quite substantially, and it was not a function of a sudden stop in these economies. Now, what lies behind it, as I mentioned to you, they're doing very differently in terms of the building up of tradable export capacities. So here you can see exports in goods in blue and in services in orange, relative to GDP. And here you can see, well, two groups of countries, which, although most of them are very small economies, have a very low share of exporting compared to GDP, given normally the size of the countries. These are some of the southern European economies, Greece, Portugal, Spain, and just another group which creates headache in some way because of future enlargement and also the current situation of course, in these countries. These are the Western Balkan countries, Albania, Macedonia, Serbia, etc. Yeah? Also with rather weak exporting possibilities. And you see also Ukraine rather stagnant in terms of exporting activity. And on the other hand, you can see the Central European economies, CE5, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, really being now one of the most potent actually exporting economies in Europe. Of course, very strongly linked to, we call it the Central European Manufacturing Core, which is the sort of production network which developed especially from German companies, but also Austrian, Swiss, Dutch, Swedish economies, which are building up strong production linkages. You can see that over here, what is used over here are basically international production network analysis in order to find out what are contributions by different countries to directly or indirectly to European exports. So these are value-added export shares, directly and indirectly, of different economies. The darker shaded areas are if countries are contributing much beyond the average, beyond their GDP shares. So they are more powerful exporting than their weight in GDPs. And the lighter shaded areas are the ones which contribute much less. On the left-hand side, you see it in manufacturing, and on the right-hand side, you see it for total exporting activity. And the two are quite similar. There are some exceptions, like obviously Norway doing better because it exports a lot of oil and gas, and therefore it's not doing well in manufacturing, but it is an important exporting economy directly and indirectly through its oil and gas exports. But otherwise, you see, if you're strong in manufacturing, especially in countries which are sort of low, medium income countries, you're also relatively strong in total tradable capacities. And therefore, it shows the importance of industrial location factors. And we see, actually, if one looks at these things dynamically, which you can't see in this picture, there is more and more concentration of manufacturing industry in what I mentioned before, the Central European Manufacturing Core, which is at the global level doing rather well as compared to, let's say, the United States or Japan, other advanced economies. Europe or the EU as a whole is actually holding up relatively well in industrial exporting at the global level, but it's highly concentrated in this core area. Let me move a little bit to social issues. I think we could see, I'm sure you could see it also in Russia and whatever other countries are participating in the session. The COVID crisis had very strong distributional implications. It impacted quite differentially on different social groups, different age groups, by gender, male, female, migrants, non-migrants, how were they affected in the labor market. In other ways, it affected different groups, differentiated by educational levels. Obviously, the people who managed to work more from home are the ones which have higher educational attainment levels. There are strong income and wealth differentiation forces which are going on. I already mentioned the rather big jump in work organization, which is to some extent quite impressive, actually, how quickly organizations adapted to it. This conference is an example of that. But of course, it will be very interesting to see what impact it again has in the long run, and whether the social differentiation going along with it might be overcome in some way. So basically, we're all quite interested in the question, what are the long run impacts of these differentiation processes? How strong will hysteretic, long-lasting effects of these uneven impacts be? How strong will be the scarring that people who have, for example, young people who would have moved into the job market and couldn't do that for a while? How strong is this scarring effects? Or women who moved much more into inactivity because of the sort of double burdens they had at home, whether the activity rates, which have fallen quite dramatically for women, whether they're going to come back. And apart from these, let's say, social differentiation tendencies, we are also quite interested to see there were big policy responses to these issues. But do they really mean that there is a long running, that there is also a hysteretic effect, a structural policy shift in how national countries develop their social labor market policies, and especially at the EU level, whether there is going to be a development? I would have done another section on industrial policy, where there is also a lot of thinking, but I won't have time for that, but we can come back to that in the discussion. So just quickly on the social differentiation, we know that the COVID crisis affected people who have temporary jobs, who are more informally, less in the gig economy. The self-employed were much more strongly affected, and the social protection schemes didn't cover them very well. So there is quite a bit of rethinking about how to do that, how to change to some extent the security structures. Well, we know that young people had a big problem, basically the ones who recently entered the labor market before the crisis, or who wanted to move into the labor market. Also the ones who waited for training places, of course, in people in further education were strongly affected. I already mentioned the gap between men and women, which had been closing before the crisis, opened up. And also the poverty rates affected much more strongly households with single mothers. And the question, of course, is again, to which extent one can build up some policy support in this direction and reverse it. And of course, there is the gap in schooling, which is still ongoing, the sort of missing presence in schools, universities, primary schools, and so on, again, with very differential impacts on children coming from different social layers. So just some pictures here. You can see this much stronger impact on employment. These are basically still in the first phase of the epidemic. There is a rather good database developing in this respect across all EU economies. You can see females more strongly affected than males, but there is also the age distribution. It's well known that by occupations, by professions, there was a very differential impact in more elementary occupations, also in industry, but especially also in service and sales workers who were quite strongly impacted. And of course, we know that work at home, these are really just a selection. There's much more material on that. Of course, affects people who have different places at home. So here you can see the square meters available for households in the different income deciles. You can see, of course, in the top deciles, there's much more space, and to some extent, people were hardly feeling a negative impact of the pandemic in terms of how much work they could do. To some extent, it intensified and increased even their productivity levels. But it was very uneven. Policy responded with a huge amount of policy measures. You can see over here in the brackets inside the box how many policy measures were counted, basically, and many of them entirely new measures, to support businesses staying afloat, income protection beyond short-term work, many employment protection and retention incentives, poverty support, trying to keep, for example, with taking over fixed costs, of businesses so they would continue to be in existence. Of course, again, in recovery. I think what we all worry about is that there was not enough emphasis put on training. I think I come to that on the next slide. So what's happening next? Well, we are in the third wave, and many of these schemes are being extended. Some of you might know there was a rather interesting new scheme at the EU level, the so-called Shure Scheme, which tried to widen the scope of countries to give a short-time work support. So people didn't have to be sacked from their businesses when there was closures, but keeping a lot of the employees in employment. And this funding was really supported with about 100 billion euros from the EU level side. And it is hoped that this will be, let's say, an embryonic version of something which could become an EU-wide unemployment insurance or reinsurance scheme, but even going beyond that, some EU-level training schemes. There is, of course, a big jump in public budgets, budget debt, public debt. I'll come to that in the next slide. And there will surely be a return of the debates between, let's say, fiscal conservatives and more Keynesian positions as soon as the recovery starts, to which extent we are moving towards a more restrictive fiscal policy scenario. Well, as I mentioned to you, we still go through a period where these inequalities are being strengthened, compounded. We have to think not only about the unemployment, but to reverse the move towards inactivity, which might be prolonged. The change of telework and the differentiated impact it has to be addressed also in the form of regulation. Self-employed were very strongly hit, the smaller entities, and they were not very well covered. And as I mentioned before, there was not enough emphasis on training and recruitment support, and that has to be getting more and more attention, especially because we are going to see more and more the impact of technological change, the digitization speeded up through the COVID crisis, but also, of course, the EU policy programs further and further enhance that. But it could very well be that this would have a very uneven impact. And similarly, the green economy policies, which are also very much incentivized, again, can have very strongly uneven regional and social impacts. And training, retraining, also infrastructure policy is very important to counteract that. Okay, just shortly on the public or fiscal situation, what you see over here is some comparison with what is done at the national level. These are the sort of red and blue shaded areas, and the green things, which are things done at the EU level. So basically what is done at the EU level is still very small, because if you just look at expenditure, these are the sort of darker green areas, the 2.8% of GDP, which is sort of more or less seen as being the type of spending which accompanies the EU programs. I'll come back to that, this well-known program, the Resilience and Recovery Program, which was an innovation. The other ones are loan programs, while on the left-hand side, you see what's done on the fiscal side. Again, cumulative over a 2-year period, you can see a dramatic further and further increase in fiscal deficit positions by countries, moving up to the 20% level of GDP over a 2-year period. You can see how it's continuously being upgraded. But in fact, if you look at the countries which are sort of low-income countries or the southern EU countries, although in the previous graph we showed that the EU programs are quite small compared to national programs, if you look at those countries, they are very significant. Yeah. Again, if you think purely in expenditure terms, that's the darker green areas, but they amount to quite significant supports for both the southern EU countries and also the Central Eastern European economies, lower or medium income countries in the EU, and are therefore a very significant support scheme. What about my last segment? What about long-term policy shifts in the post-pandemic world or Europe? Yeah. So the one question we have is, are we going to avoid basically the mistakes on fiscal policy which the EU made last time? Well, it's an issue of political economic structures. In the EU, as you know, there are the sort of creditor-debtor positions, which are quite sustained, really also shape very much the bargaining stances within the EU. But so far, obviously, the EU's fiscal response was quite different from after 2008. And also, quite interestingly, and I see that very favorably, also the international organizations, IMF, World Bank, OECD, and so on, are quite attentive to avoiding a too quick return to austerity measures or to restrictive measures, in particular because in those countries where austerity measures were taken, it didn't really help the public debt situation very much. In fact, or not at all, it sometimes made it worse, basically because the contraction of GDP was outstripping what could be done in terms of what was clawed back in terms of primary fiscal surpluses, which they were forced to have. But we don't know how this debate is going to unfold. We will see what was happening. And so in that sense, at the EU level, of course, there was an important structural shift in terms of this Recovery and Resilience Fund, which was really a breaking of a taboo. I'll come back to that in the next slide. And it was also trying to structure the way how this expenditure was taking place, imposing on countries that they should support projects which are in line with the structural and industrial policy in terms of digitalization and green economy targets, which the EU has formulated for itself. So basically, some of the measures were really unprecedented, which were taken. And they were actually decided, although a lot was written about the difficult negotiations, they were decided in a rather short span of time. So the most important is, of course, this European Recovery Plan, which amounted to 715 billion euros, some of it in grants, some of it in loans, but also that was on top of having the EU budget passed through. So overall, it's closer to 1 trillion EU funding over that period of 2021-27, although the recovery fund is supposed to be spent much earlier. And there were, as I mentioned, quite a few innovative schemes, like this scheme on the short-term unemployment support, which might go on. There was a withdrawal of the EU fiscal rules and they are still out of action, which constrains fiscal policy to the famous 3% and 60% debt rule. And there were quite a number of other support schemes. So it really broke some taboos in terms of implicit fiscal transfers between countries, moving towards joint borrowing. And to some extent, economists think there will be a sort of continuation in one or the other form of that breaking of a taboo. So this is a structural shift, number 2, away from austerity, but also in this direction. The pandemic and the linked up recession exposed big gaps in the social safety net, which I pointed out before. And the question, of course, in terms of structural shift, what have we learned? To which extent are these innovations going to be an overhaul of social security systems more widely at the national level, but also with some ingredients at the EU level? So in that sense, you can say this is our structural shift number 3 in the social protection systems. There's a lot of details one could discuss, and also to what extent it really leads to a much more bigger strengthening of the social pillar. Alexei, I'm going to finish in a few minutes, yeah? Don't worry. Now,
okay, yes.
Yes, the other thing is, of course, that what is the world going to be in terms of state, the role of the state? It obviously played a much bigger role and expanded in terms of its position. The company sector will still be in a weak position. There will be a debt overhang. There will be a still fragility of the banking system, although it's still in a relatively better position than after the financial crisis. But it does look to us as if the state will become a much bigger actor as before. And I think there will be discussion with that, not only on the expenditure side, on ownership issues, but also how the tax structures are going to evolve. Will there be a more progressive taxation? Will there be more wealth taxation, etc.? Will there be a minimum wage, a minimum income? A lot of discussions going on in this direction. I mentioned to you there was quite big worrying tendencies on gender differentiation. Some things were also the positive side. There was, at least again, differentiated by households, but there was a bit more involvement by fathers in childcare also during confinement. But no doubt the double burden fell much more strongly on women. And there is this major worry about increased poverty rates in single parent households, and also the long-term inactivity problem. Lastly, probably in terms of structural shift, is the EU going to, which it had hardly any role in the health sector, in health policies, but it increased its role. Well, partly didn't work that well in terms of the vaccination program and the supply of vaccines, but of course that was a policy which was done at the EU level. But nonetheless, in terms of some increase of resilience of the health sector and coordination, people do think that there will be much stronger coordination also in the future. But the question is whether that's going to move all in a wider direction and etc. So I think in terms of structural policy shifts, many areas which we are still unclear how sustained, how deep they will go, the possible turnaround towards austerity again, how much solidaristic EU will there be at the national level and the EU level, what will be the long-term overhaul of the social security systems, the role of the government, gender balance, the role of the EU in health. We also discuss, I haven't covered that, how strong, who will determine these policy shifts, how strongly will the different social policy partners be involved? Will it done top-down? Will there be involvement by in a tripartite section, etc.? So we're left with many question marks. And I think that's the end of my presentation. I added some recent publications of mine or papers you can download, which cover a lot of these areas, also covers areas it didn't cover, like the reorientation of industrial policy in the EU. So I'm going to move out of that and try to.
Thank you very much, Professor Landesmann.
Yes. I try to make you big again.
I see.
So okay, and I try to take the stop sharing here.
Okay.
Is that okay? Yeah.
Yes, yes, it's okay. Colleagues, please ask your questions. I suppose it is better to switch on microphone and begin to talk without any permissions from me.
That would be great.
Yes. Colleagues. Okay, I will start. I want to ask you about attitude of experts to recalculation or evaluation of human capital, because we can see that there is a great process of so-named amortization of human capital, because people cannot use some of their skills in a digital area. Secondly, we have a great problem with high level of mortality in old ages. But for example, in Russia, many people were at working age, even when they were in pension. And as a result, it is also a great impact on human capital, because these people received this capital in previous years, but we hope that they could work at least 3 or 5 years, but they were killed by pandemic. So can you name some, at least attempts to calculate such changes in human capital? Or it is very difficult to calculate?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, and I think probably there are two things. One is how is the demographic structure of the potential labor force going to develop? Yeah, that's still independently of what sort of human capital they have, but in a way that one is probably quite easy to do, because we know basically the mortalities and so on. We don't know. So if we look at the potential labor force, that's relatively easy to do. What will be the active labor force? That's of course another issue. Yeah. So what will be available for the economy to use is a mixture of these demographic changes, and I think it's on both ends, no? Because the education, on the one hand, you say that there are some people who had certain skills and education levels who are not here anymore, or who might not get a job again. On the other hand, there are the young whose education was interrupted or held back, and probably the quality of education has suffered. Yeah, so the second thing is, of course, the issue of how does human capital is a function both of human capital acquisition during work and also prior to work. So I think if I'm thinking about an analytical exercise, there are many screws to to work on. Yeah. So one is, if you sum it up, one is demography. Yeah, the activity rates. Yeah, then you can do these activity rates by education groups. Yeah, and then you get an idea about the educational, the composition of the active labor force. And the second one, which is probably the most difficult, how much human capital is lost because of the quality of education or the interruption of education and training of different groups. Yeah. So far, I haven't seen, probably I haven't looked sufficiently, I haven't seen an estimate of that. I think I can think of how it could be done. Yeah. Of course, with quite a few assumptions or sensitivity analysis, but it's an extremely interesting issue. And of course, as we know that long-term growth is more a function of human capital than anything else. Also for the long-term growth analysis, that would be very important. Yeah. So thanks for the question. It was a very good question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Alex, let's continue with questions and answers.
Don't feel shy. I'm used to interacting. Also, if you want to do some comparative, even if it's not a question, if you want to bring in something which you know from your own research, would be interesting. So how is actually the EU economy seen from the Russian angle? wherever you sit, you see that the problems seem worse in your place, no? Meaning we see that the problems are accumulating in the EU, and probably you see the problems accumulating in Russia. So it is interesting to see the differentiated views on structural developments and policy responses. People are shy somehow. So is there any issue which you would like me to expand on or cover which I haven't covered? You're muted, Alexei. I can't hear you. You're still muted.
Okay. I also have another question about your investigation in external trade and groups of trade. As we understand, all Eastern European countries are very close to European Union economy. And at the same time, we know that many Asian countries, especially China, demonstrated more successful recovery strategies than Europe. Can we see any shifts in the geographical structure of Eastern European countries, or attempts even of European Union members to change their geography and to be more oriented into Eastern countries, or it is rather early to make such estimates because European countries are very busy with pandemic and cannot make real changes in their geography so quickly?
Yeah, again, a very interesting question. Well, I think if you think about Eastern European countries, the pre-pandemic situation, it was basically, as I mentioned to you, very strongly oriented towards fitting into the intra-European production networks, yeah? But via the intra-European production networks, of course, being linked to extra-EU exports, yeah? So if the Central European countries are producing inputs for German manufacturers, Germany, on the other hand, you can see the reflection in German exports have become over 50% outside the EU, yeah, before the pandemic, than inside the EU. So obviously, the EU as a whole is shifting, has been shifting geographic patterns, yeah. And in that sense, you can say the Central and Eastern European countries were indirectly contributing with their supplies to these international redirection or changing geographic patterns, yeah. And that is a long-run tendency, and there's to some extent no reason. Well, there might be geopolitical reasons, that this will not continue. I mean, that is a global world trade pattern. Yeah, that the East Asian economies, also South Asian economies, I think one should include India gradually here into that, are going to continue to move on a faster growth path, and therefore are important markets. On top of that, of course, could be the situation that there was a rather privileged position of Western multinationals in these countries, including China, and that might become a bit more constrained, basically because a country like China is gradually building up or has been building up its own capacities and is less dependent on the platforms which Western multinationals organized in these countries. So I think in that sense, it's not only exports and FDI will be affected by the technological catching up here, which is going on in a country like China. So I think interesting patterns of trade and FDI will reflect these longer term trends. Now, what happened during the pandemic? Well, initially it was, of course, like during the financial crisis, a quite sharp drop in trade altogether. And of course, in that sense, the Eastern European countries also suffered from the trading side in terms of the intra-EU and therefore indirect link. Over time, again, one can see now that the EU is doing quite well in exporting abroad, outside the EU, again, with the Asian direction, and therefore it's pulling along the intra-European networks. When you spoke about the increasing potential influence of East Asia in Europe, well, one thing is, of course, China is an active investor, yeah, especially in public infrastructure, and has a different acquisition policy in the more advanced Western European countries as compared to the Eastern European countries. In the Western European countries, it is like one would expect an acquisition in order to acquire know-how, technological know-how. And in the Central and Eastern European, but also in the Balkan countries, it's very much also involved in infrastructure. And these are significant contributions. I think from a China perspective, of course, that there's a strong incentive to continue on these lines. But you also know that the EU has shifted its industrial policy in one of the more recent formulations, is really sort of trying to guard technological know-how and even to guard strategic sectors and bits in both in the EU, but also in adjoining countries to sort of constrain the influence of China. So I think this is a tendency which will be there. Of course, the countries have their own minds and interests here. And in some of the countries, there is a confluence of interests. If you think about Hungary or Serbia, of working on, of riding on both horses, yeah, at the same time, yeah. So I think this play will go on. I mean, this is our long-term geostrategic world in which we live, in which this will continue. Of course, we don't. The whole thing also depends, of course. I mean, it's difficult enough to forecast what's happening in Europe, yeah. It's probably even more difficult to forecast what's happening in China. So, and linked with that, what happens to the relationship between the West or the US in particular in China, which will shape, of course, the relationship also between European actors and China here. And there is a highly complex situation in Asia itself. Yeah. I'm not an expert, but of course I'm following that, and I'm sure people in the audience know more about that. But all these things are in motion and with potential conflictual issues. I can see somebody might have wanted to say something.
Excuse me, dear colleagues, can I also ask a question?
Yes.
On my camera, or yeah, I try to. Yeah, can you see me?
Excellent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your report. It's very interesting. I want to ask you a question from the point of view of Spanish economy. I'm specializing in investigation of Spanish economy, and I know that Spain has become one of the key recipients of European funds to fight with COVID. It's about 250 billion euro, but the problem is in the low effectiveness of these funds implementation. I would like to ask you maybe what are European measures, what are the measures of European institutes to fight against this low effectiveness of funds implementation?
Thank you for your question. Well, I think this is now a very interesting period because, as you know, from these recovery and resilience funds, people had to submit now their proposals, yeah? And at least in writing, so far, for example, there are some rather good stories from Greece and from Italy. Yeah, I haven't seen a similar report yet whether Spain has delivered its proposals, but it looks as if, to some extent, a change from the past, Italy and Greece has really thought very carefully through a type of strategy what to use with these funds. Yeah. In fact, there were very high-level committees involved in setting up these things, and of course the Draghi government in Italy helped. Now, yes, this of course builds on a long history of using structural funds in the past, and we know that both Spain and Italy, Portugal, have a very mixed record. Yeah, I mean they both have huge regional inequalities, problems, and of course a lot of these funds went into the weak regions where the institutional framework and local authorities have a much worse track record here than in the more advanced regions. So Spain is a very regionally differentiated country here, which of course also shows the tensions which emerge here between the more advanced regions and the southern regions. Well, my recipe on these issues is you have to work very, very strongly with supporting the quality of local institutions, basically. Yeah? Sometimes it works with a sort of demonstration effect. You sort of develop a paragon region in a difficult, for local authority in a difficult region, and give it a lot of support and show that if you improve the institutionally that region, yeah, it really has a very strong demonstration effect in terms of implementation and success. Yeah, it worked in some of the Eastern European regions. Yeah, okay, that you single out for major technical support. Yeah. A particular region, and then it has an impact on other regions. We can say, oh, look, if we use these funds more, we are becoming also more popular as a local authority. Yeah? So there's also political interest. So I think it's something where, on the one hand, we have a long history of experience with using structural funds, yeah. But in many ways, it also didn't work that well in many regions. So we have to understand what works with the success stories and what is really continuing not to work. I think the long-run Spanish problems, well, I tried to sketch it a little bit, was that it did quite well when it joined the EU in terms of building up quite strong industrial capacities, yeah, in certain regions. It built up, as you know, the car industry was doing well and so on. But there was a strong shift, yeah, and I think the structural problems in Spain deepened to some extent, yeah, over the period, especially to some extent also with enlargement, and there was not enough forward-looking counter strategies to deal with it. Do you want to add something from your side? What are your insights into this issue on Spain?
Actually, I'm studying now this issue, and I would like to thank you about your comment on this issue. Yes, I was wondering why Spain has become one of the key recipients, while at the same time the effectiveness of funds implementation in Spain is above about 30%, while in average in European Union, this number is about 40%. So, and I'm studying this issue now, and I'd like to thank you on your comment. Yes, it's very valuable for me. Thank you.
No, I think usually the distribution of these funds is not a function of whether you use them well or badly. It goes on by need rather than. I guess it's a socialist principle, by need and not by by this, whether you deserve it. But of course, there are certain mechanisms which tries to monitor the effectiveness. Yeah, and but I think you're probably quite right. A much stronger emphasis on the effectiveness and trying to do something about improving effectiveness would be very important. Yeah.
So there is a huge field in improving the quality of European institutions in this field, of course. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's probably less at the EU level. Unfortunately, the structural funds moved more away from Brussels in a sense, the execution. Yeah, well, the countries were pushing very much, we want to be in control of structural funds money here. And therefore, there is less possibility of monitoring and controlling that they are used in a positive way. I think there was somebody else. Yeah.
Yes, Anastasia Nevskaya, please. Anastasia, yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Landesmann, for your speech. It was really interesting. I'm Anastasia Nevskaya from the Institute of World Economy and International Relations.
Can you put your camera on also, so I can see you?
Unfortunately, I cannot. I'm not very familiar with this interface. I'm very familiar with Zoom, but not with this thing. I'm sorry for that.
There's a little camera next to the microphone, which is just
yeah, but actually,
okay, never mind.
There is nothing.
It's okay.
So my question was about you talked quite a lot about the post-pandemic configuration of European economy, of what's going, how it is going to look like, and one of the core issues here, I think, is decarbonization, ecological shift, Green Deal, and everything. And if we talk about Russia, the issue of special interest here is the transborder carbon tax, which is going to be introduced maybe in the coming weeks, some version of it at least. So I was quite interested about your opinion, how this measure is going to influence European competitiveness, because there are different opinions as well. The imports is going to be more expensive, and maybe there will be some reorientation and everything. And how is going to influence Russia-EU relations, of course, and maybe relations of European Union with its other core trade partners. Thank you.
Yeah, a very, very good and interesting question. It's well, I think the Green Deal is real. It is really manifest not only in all the policy positions at the EU level, but I think you can see a real shift in many countries here. I mean, think about at the moment, the Green Party in Germany is in all polling much more prominent than the Social Democratic Party, which is really a break, yeah, with the political past of Germany here. In Austria, we have a Green Party in government, yeah, and it's happening in quite a lot of countries. So it's not just a structure which is sort of imposed at the EU level or some enlightened technocrats, but it seems to be quite deeply ingrained across the political spectrum. Now, what comes with it is, well, I mentioned to you before that it does mean it's a strong directive in terms of industrial policy measures, again, at the EU level and at the national level, with the idea that you get two things at the same time. You not only fulfill certain climate policy goals, but you, I mean, Europe always thought it would be have a first mover advantage, but it might not be anymore the pioneer in everything. But nonetheless, it doesn't want to lose out on being particularly strong in green technology, in green industries, in green activities. Yeah. So in that sense, at least one sells this package as being not only an environmental policy, a climate change policy, but also a competitiveness policy. Yeah. Now, of course, if you do that, you use certain instruments. Yeah, you use tax instruments, and you use instruments which also deal with the issue of relocation of activities which avoid those tax. The impact of tax or subsidy instruments. And of course, as you mentioned, the transborder carbon tax will be such an instrument. By the way, there is not only from a public finance point of view, a logical link between the internal subsidy incentive measures and the external carbon border tax. But there is also an interest in the sort of own resource discussion, meaning that and I think it's very sensible that the EU tries to get away from this bizarre bargaining over each financial budget, every 7 years, and tries to build up stronger EU budget instruments, EU tax instruments or income instruments. And the transborder carbon tax might be such an instrument. In fact, in the past, whatever tariffs existed, that was one of the own income source of the EU budget in the past. But since tariffs have declining, the EU budget has lost this instrument, and probably the carbon tax could fill one of the elements in that. Now, you're asking about the impact on EU-Russia relations. Obviously, one knows that this will lead to conflict. Well, if I might make a provocative statement, which I'm sure you might have a different position on it and know much more about it. I think whatever the EU does which helps Russia to diversify its economy is good for Russia. Okay, so whatever means that it creates a situation where Russia weans itself away from too much dependence on oil and gas in the long run is good for Russia. So it could very well be that just like it moves in Europe, various tax instruments punish industries which are using, which are CO2 producing, that is an external tax, which might have a similar impact. And therefore, the logic would be that it shouldn't be seen, at least it might be contrary to domestic interest groups, but it might not be counter to Russia's long-term industrial and economic development strategy. But I would be interested to what your views are on that point.
Thank you very much. I'll try to.
Oh, excellent. Now we can see it.
Actually, I agree with you about the possibility to modernize Russian economy somehow. But I also think that it's going to be quite a useful thing for Russian-European relations in some technical point of view, because the measure is quite difficult. How we count all these tariffs, how we apply it, how we just count the some countermeasures and everything, and then there will be a lot of contacts, consultations on experts level, on corporate levels, so on. So I think some kind of grassroots cooperation doesn't hurt to Russia. And what you told about the competitiveness of the EU, I'm not agree. Well, I agree about the very useful thing for European budget, of course. But if we look from the perspective of European companies, of European importers, from Russia and etc., they are not quite happy, I think, because they are going to get more expensive stuff, and I think they are a little bit concerned about that. So that's also a point.
No, I think you're obviously right. I mean, any measures has winners and losers, so, I mean, this is a deep structural shift which is happening here, probably in many economies of the world. And structural shift is difficult. It means a relocation of important capacities, a readaptation, a loss of certain skills of certain companies and so on. And I think economists are always very bad to study transitional dynamics. So one forgets about very often about the structural change costs. And I think you're quite right. We can't just look at it in terms of a comparative static, what will be in the end and what will be at the beginning. We have to study. And of course, that's not only relevant from a welfare point of view, welfare analysis point of view, but it's relevant for the political dynamic, which might or might not lead to a good way of putting a policy structure in place. And I'm pretty sure that the outcome will be some compromise, because the interest groups which want to maintain a certain cost structures will be quite active, and so will be other interest groups, yeah, which are competing interest groups, yeah. And that's probably true both on the EU side and probably also true on the Russian side, but probably it might be more lopsided on the Russian side than on the EU side, yeah. I feel, I think from a pure, let's say, economist logic, yeah, that's what I had tried to explain. It does make sense, yeah. But of course, the strength and the time path in which you impose it, yeah, and in which you allow adjustments, yeah, to take place, and possibly give some support in this adjustment. You know, for example, the policy in the EU has now a big bowl of money to support countries like Poland to wean itself away from coal, yeah, okay. So similarly, there will be structural adjustment policies, which will also be an outcome of this political compromise, yeah, which will accompany the adjustment of those companies which are highly dependent on the supply at certain prices, yeah. I think it will simply be it's not only, let's say good economic policy, it's also going to be the outcome of the politics, yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to follow this process. It's very, very interesting, and I think it's going to be something very useful out of it.
Thank you very much. Well, it will be nice to keep in touch on this, how it evolves on both sides, actually.
Sure, sure.
You're very welcome to always email me and
of course.
In touch.
Thank you.
Lovely.
Thank you, colleagues. Any other questions? Colleagues? Well,
Alexei, I would also be interested in your views on EU-Russia relations, if nobody else has a question at the moment. But
I cannot see. It is also a problem that we switched to the MS Teams after almost a year of Zoom. Attendance, and I understand sometimes people cannot switch on something like this. But if we really don't have any questions, colleagues, try to give me a sign. Well, I suppose maybe it is really the lack of questions. Mihaэль Landesmann was our guest, and great thanks for your really interesting report and answers to our questions. And I hope that pandemic will be very soon near its end, and we can see each other not only by MS Teams or other digital means, but alive in next April conference of the high school economics, or within other scientific conferences. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much, and I look forward to, we should keep an academic and dialogue going between us and you, yeah. And I think it's very, very important for the European situation that this communication and also joint work proceeds. So we have to know more about each other. So thank you very much for the invitation, Alexei. Yes.
Thank you.
So see you either in Vienna or wherever. Yeah. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
And thanks for the audience, and thanks for the questions.
Okay.